Hello AP World History students, Mr. Lassiter here with you. And in this video we're going to continue our look at time period 5, reviewing for your AP World History exam. In Unit 5 we're dealing with industrialization and global integration from 1750 to 1900. And as we saw in the last video, this rise of industrialization brings about another large trend, and that is imperialism and nation-state formation. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Remember that there is a review packet in the description down below, so you can fill that out as we look at Key Concept 5.2. And if you want any more information, I recommend AP Worldopedia and Freemanpedia, both with some more information for you. So let's go ahead and get started. And I want us to think generally about Key Concept 5.2, imperialism and nation-state formation. There are three major trends or ideas that we see. In this time period, we see that those industrializing powers from Key Concept 5.1 establish transoceanic empires. That is, empires that are not immediately connected to them but are found across oceans. Another thing that we see is that imperialism influences state formation as well as contraction around the world, so the growth and contraction of states. And lastly, the justification for imperialism was often founded in new racial ideologies, especially social Darwinism, which facilitated these imperialist expansions and ambitions. So we're going to focus on those three things today. And let's start with industrializing powers establishing their transoceanic empires. So the first thing that we see is that there are states with existing colonies in this time period that strengthened their control over these colonies. And our best examples are the British in India and the Dutch in Indonesia. During this time period, the British had already had a presence in India, and they had competed with the Dutch and the French for control over areas. But as the Mughal Empire continued to weaken, the British are able to strengthen and expand their control over India and trade within India, eventually creating or bringing direct control over India under the British Raj following the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Another example of this, of course, being Dutch Indonesia, a region where the Dutch had control at the beginning of this time period, but they will strengthen their control over those colonies as they continue to extract raw materials and sell finished products in those regions. The next thing that we see is that European states, as well as the United States and Japan, established empires throughout Asia and the Pacific. And this is seen in these two images on your video. The 10,000 miles from tip to tip. In 1898, the United States not only had completed its quote-unquote manifest destiny with the push westward to the Pacific Ocean, but they had begun to create transoceanic empires of their own, winning the Spanish-American War in 1898. They acquired Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, among other islands. In the 1890s, they had established control over Hawaii, and even before that, they had purchased Alaska. So the United States was beginning to expand much like other European industrial powers. The United States did not want to think of themselves necessarily as imperialist, yet they were. You can see the comparison of 1898 to 1798 and just how rapid this and widespread this U.S. expansion was. In Japan, we see another example of this, as Meiji Japan rapidly industrialized and began to expand imperially as well, starting with the takeover of Korea. Eventually, the Japanese defeat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War and will continue their expansion all the way up until World War II. being an imperial power themselves. But the other part of this key concept is not just that European states established empires throughout Asia and the Pacific, and America and Japan did, but some places we see this influence decline. For example, Spain and Portugal's influence declines in this time period, especially with their loss of colonies in the Americas. Spain will, of course, lose colonies in South America and Mesoamerica, and Portugal loses that all-important colony of Brazil. These losses are detailed more in Key Concept 5.3. However, there are European states which establish empires in this time period. The British expand their empire, and you can see them on this map. The French expand their empires overseas, so do the Dutch, the Germans, as well as the Russians expanding their empire into Siberia, pushing all the way to the Pacific Ocean. European states used both warfare and diplomacy in establishing their empires, especially on the continent of Africa. And you probably recall the discussion of imperialism with the Scramble for Africa. And that Scramble for Africa was set off when the the Belgians initially began their exploration of the Congo under the direction of King Leopold. And European nations met together in Berlin to establish ground rules for Europeans gobbling up land in Africa. European countries met, they agreed, the Africans themselves were not present. But they did use both warfare and diplomacy. And some of the empires that were established in Africa that you need to know, of course, are Britain in West Africa, the French in West Africa, and the Belgians in the Congo. Those are some good examples to know, especially the brutal treatment of the Belgians of the Congolese people as they extracted rubber. In some parts of their empires, of course, Europeans established settler colonies. And this is seen on this map as well. The British, for example, established settler colonies in South Africa, where the Dutch had already settled. But eventually, of course, the British took that over and pushed the Boers inland in the Boer Wars. The British also settled Australia and New Zealand. We'll see in Key Concept 5.4 that some of that is a forced migration of convicts to Australia, but ultimately the British do settle and establish colonies there. And one that may not be so well known is the settler colony of France and Algeria. The French settle northern Algeria, the more fertile lands, and they themselves kind of see this as part of France. At least the French settlers there would have been considered French. And this colony provided vital resources and agricultural support to the industrializing France. In other parts of the world, we see that industrialized states practice economic imperialism. And this is seen with two primary examples. The first being the expansion of Britain into China via the Opium Wars. In the mid-1800s, the British found themselves at a major trade deficit with China, who had no real desire or demand for British goods. And so Britain looked to something that they could sell in China, and they turned to the sale of opium, a highly addictive substance, which at one time was banned in Britain while being sold in China. It was grown in Central and South Asia, in British colonies, and then shipped to China and sold. When the Chinese government attempted to ban the sale of opium, the British responded with war, opening China up to British demands, and ultimately to other European countries establishing spheres of influence. Other examples of economic imperialism are seen with both British and U.S. investment in Latin America. One company specifically that we see is the United Fruit Company, for example, a U.S. company which wields a great deal of not just economic but political control in South America. Our second major idea for this key concept 5.2 is that imperialism influenced state formation and contraction around the world. And we're going to start with this in Japan. The expansion of the United States and European influence over Tokugawa Japan, which had been the ruling era of the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan, led to the emergence of a new era in Japan known as Meiji Japan. Commodore Matthew Perry, who you see pictured here, cruised up to Japan with his boats with gunboats, and demanded via a letter of the U.S. government that Japan trade with the United States and allow the United States to sell goods in Japan. Well, Japan, throughout its history, while remaining very isolated in our last time period, did see the value of Western education. Dutch learning, they called it. And so they, realizing that this was inevitable and looking at the example of China with its loss in the Opium Wars to Britain and its inevitable subjugation to Europeans, Japan decides to take a different route. And so they actively seek to modernize. And so we see the development of a government that is in support of industrialization in Japan, and we see that rapid industrialization. These great images show that those changes that take place very quickly in Japan by the end of the 19th century. We see Japan with this mix of traditional culture and Western culture. The iron bridges, the torpedoes as the military modernized, the Western style wear, the factories, alongside with traditional Japanese architecture and clothing. So all this was taking place in Japan, and this imperialism, this industrialization that's going to occur really does shape Japan in the late 19th and 20th centuries. The United States and Russia also go through some transformations as they emulated European transoceanic imperialism by expanding their own land borders and conquering neighboring territories. And so this is something that I started off with in this video, looking at how the United States first expanded westward to the Pacific Ocean in what they called Manifest Destiny, pushing Native Americans west, forcefully moving others, and then the purchasing of Alaska in the 1860s, eventually the annexing of Hawaii, and of course the territorial acquisitions that came with the Spanish-American War. The U.S. also acquired other territories in land grabs in search of guano, the ever-important fertilizer that is made of bird feces. Russia also emulated this European imperialism. They expanded their own land borders, conquering neighboring territories, and you can see the land acquisitions here in the 1800s under Alexander I, Nicholas I, Alexander II, and Alexander III. Russia expanded greatly to stretch all the way from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Now, these imperialist practices, of course, were transformative for the countries that were expanding. But that does not mean they were accepted by the people who were taken over. Anti-imperial resistance took various forms, including direct resistance within empires and the creation of new states on the peripheries of empires. And you can imagine, or you probably have studied, some of the examples of direct resistance within empires. Some of the ones that you see here include the Sepoy Rebellion, as the British would call it, or the Indian Rebellion of 1847, or 1857, excuse me, as it would be seen in In India, a war for independence. This resistance was also seen in the United States. As the United States attempted to move Native Americans westward, the Cherokee Indians, most notably, directly resisted the United States and attempted to stay put. In South Africa, the Zulu kingdom fought wars with Great Britain, surprising them at first, winning some major battles before eventually being overtaken by the British. And then, of course, there are examples of new states on the edge of existing empires. As the Ottoman Empire weakened in this time period and began to contract, we see that new independent Balkan states were established. Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia eventually. And these states, of course, as they became established, would lead to greater instability in the Balkan regions, which, as we get to the beginning of our time period 6, we know will lead to a great war, what we call the First World War. And our last major idea for this key concepts is that new racial ideologies, especially the idea of social Darwinism, facilitated and justified imperialism. And this is something you might know well, but these pseudoscientific developments, which attempted to apply Darwin's theory of evolution to different racial groups in the world, served as justification for Europeans taking over other regions. Some Europeans saw themselves as superior mentally, physically, to Africans, to Asians, to South Americans, and they saw it as their quote-unquote duty to civilize these otherwise uncivilized peoples. Europeans began to see it as their duty. Rudyard Kipling, the author of The Jungle Book, called this the white man's burden, and it was something that was seen in a lot of different writings of the time period. Europeans using new ideas of race, which had before this time period really never been used in quite this same way. They use these ideas to try to justify their takeover of these outlying areas of the world. So that's it for key concept 5.2, thinking about imperialism and nation-state formation. This, of course, will play a large role in the coming world wars in time period 6, and of course, it is intricately connected to what you learned and what you reviewed for key concept 5.1. So don't forget that. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments down below, and we'll see you in the next video.